This is the first module talking about the development and operation of urban political structures. We're going to talk about the idea of machine politics as they worked in cities and talk a bit about why they emerged particularly in the late 1800s, early 1900s, why machine politics were considered to be in need of reform, and then what the progressive reformers attempted to be able to do to replace them. So that's the overview of what we're going to take a look at here. Got some interesting quotes here helping us understand machines. So these are taken from Clarence Stone, who's an urban political scientist, and he's pointed these out as being good examples of what machine politics was all about. So here's Martin Lomaisny from Boston. I think that there's got to be in every ward somebody that any bloke can come to no matter what he's done and get help. Help you understand, none of your law and justice, but help, right? So, you know, the idea that it was really the people on the ground that got things done and that the justice system didn't really work well for people, and, you know, the actual kind of government itself was not going to respond to the needs, particularly of poorer people and immigrants within society. One of the biggest and most well-known machines was what was called Tammany Hall in New York City, and Boss Plunkett there was well known for excellent quotes concerning, you know, what the machine politics were all about. So here's a good quote from him. For instance, here's how I gather in young men. I hear of a young feller that's proud of his voice, thinks that he can sing fine. I ask him to come around to Washington Hall and our glee club. He comes and sings, and he's a follower of Plunkett for life. Another young feller gains a reputation as a baseball player in a vacant lot. I bring him into our baseball club. That fixes him. You'll find him working for my ticket at the polls next election day. Here's another good example of machine politics. What I look for in a prospective captain is a young person, man or woman, mostly men though, who is interested in getting some material return out of his political activity. I much prefer this type to the type that is enthused about the party cause or all hot in a particular issue. Enthusiasm for causes is short-lived, but necessity of making a living is permanent. I think that quote's just absolutely perfect in describing what the political machines were all about. That was not necessarily policy success, not necessarily providing the services that were necessary in order to be able for the city to run effectively for everyone. It was based on attempting to be able to win political power, and people that were more interested in political power and achieving some gain for themselves were really people that the machine looked for. The last quote here, there was not much interest in the election and there was no use in spending money. But the district leader said, "Hello, Ben, have you voted yet?" "No, Mr. Carey, I ain't voted." "Well, Ben, here's 50 cents. Go on in and vote." "No, Mr. Carey, if I don't get $1, I'll vote on my principles." So, again, a different example. One, the type of people that work for the political parties, generally people out for their own gain, but then also the need to be able to get voters to vote them into office also resulted in some corruption as well. So here's the political machine structure and the way it was set up. And really, what we have here is each one of these parts is necessary for the machine to function as a whole and function effectively. And if one of the blocks kind of falls out, then you'll see that the machine structure doesn't work. So on the one hand, we have party officials and party workers, right? These are the people that basically make the rules for the city. They may or may not be elected officials. The boss of the political party oftentimes wasn't an elected official, just the boss of a political party, and they would install a figurehead type mayor and people in political positions of power that were guaranteed to vote for what they wanted. But suffice it to say that they had to get those people voted into office. So how do you do that? Well, you go out and you make voters, a number of voters basically reliant on your services. And what would happen oftentimes in many of these cities was there was a large amount of new immigrants, and the political parties would go out and organize those people. They helped them when they got to the United States to be able to find work, find housing, provide rudimentary social services such as giving them food. In some cases, people in that point in time were using coal as heat. They would give them coal, and basically the voters came to rely on the political party machines in order to be able to integrate themselves into American culture, and they relied on them for social services that most governments didn't provide at that point in time. So they really served kind of a need for the base of that political party. Now, what we see up at the top here is the idea of business, is the third ingredient in the political machine structure. Business was essential because business provided the party with the money in order to be able to support the workers and the voters. So they had to organize the party structure in order to be able to get people out to vote so that they could be elected, and business was responsible then for giving the party money in order for them to be able to mobilize voters. In return, of course, businesses wanted something, and that was favoritism on contracts and the ability to be able to use government services at their leisure. So everybody kind of made out in this situation. The party kept control of government. They kept control by getting money from businesses and then providing businesses with the services that they wanted, and then the voters were necessary in order to be able to gain control of the government. Now, a lot has been said. You might take a look at some of those early quotes and say to yourself, well, this is just pure out-and-out corruption. And that, through many of the strands of the literature that study this, is certainly what most people think, and we've tried to reform these governments. But people have also taken a look at political machines and said, well, they did serve some sort of purposes for government at the local level. One is that traditionally immigrants within these cities didn't have much of a voice, and the political machines oftentimes organized these people that were voiceless, and through their ability to be able to provide services to these immigrants and securing their votes as a consequence of that, it did give them some voice that they didn't naturally have otherwise or wouldn't have had otherwise. Second thing is that there was really no real social safety net. It wasn't until we got into the New Deal of the 1930s where the federal government really started to supply services for the poor. So what we had here was limited government services. Mostly people that were poor were reliant on charity, and the political machines actually helped to provide some of those social safety net aspects that were not there at that point in time, at least coming from government. And then finally, they didn't really focus a lot on issues that were divisive. They just wanted things like infrastructure projects, things that provided jobs, and controversy and so forth was kind of swept under the table, so there was more of a consensus politics at that time. Now, of course, I think the idea of the negative side of political machines is readily apparent just from some of those quotes earlier to our kind of 21st century mentality of what government should do. So this was all about corruption and inside politics. It was your ability to be able to pay people to vote, provide them with services that would make them loyal to you, and then basically extracting a price from businesses in order to be able to have them get the contracts that they should have been able to get anyway. So that doesn't appeal to some people as well. Additionally, most everything here is it's a certain type of politics that's based on favoritism, not on actually who's most qualified, not on the best ideas. Rather, who do you know, how do you know them, and what are you paying them to get what you want? One of the other problems is, I did mention the positive, is that it gave voice to immigrants, but this was typically to European immigrants, Irish, Italians, various other Polish immigrants, and other groups. What we didn't see was it did not make an attempt through the political machine to really enfranchise or give power to other minorities, particularly African Americans at this time. So that was one of the negatives about it as well. It didn't give voice to these groups. So one of the big problems was this was really, when we talk about what's called the mobilization of bias, in other words, what is government focusing in on? And what it focuses in on oftentimes leaves other stuff out, because they were really focused on projects that provided jobs. So it says bricks and mortar there, infrastructure projects, roads, buildings, things like that. They didn't think too much about, social equality and making the society more equitable. So that was one thing that was left out as well. And then finally, this idea of having politics run by graph and run by machines, is not the most efficient way to be able to run a government, and overall was, not very good for the economy because the purpose was not to do things as best as you possibly could, as cheaply as you could. It was to provide work for those people that were loyal to you at a cost that would benefit them so that you could benefit later on. Now, why was it that the political machines kind of declined? We still, to a certain extent, have political machines in many big cities, but nowhere near the power that they had in the late 19th century and early 20th century. I think there are a couple of things. One is that there was a group of people who were called reformers, mostly considered to be people that were associated with the progressive movement in the early 1900s. And they instituted a number of structural changes at the local government level, as well as the state level, that attempted to be able to take power away from the political machines. So there's a number of things listed here that we'll talk about in depth a little bit later. But one thing to think about was, if the political parties are the cause of this problem because of their political favoritism, one way to get around that is to really do away with political parties. So we don't think about this very often, but in the United States, about 70% of all local elections are actually nonpartisan elections, where people don't run on the Republican or the Democratic label, rather they just run as individuals. And this was a hallmark of the reformers and the progressive movement, because they sought to do this by taking power away from the political parties and therefore not having people be beholden to political parties that were elected officials. Second thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the city council at large. One of the things was, when you had district elections, that basically meant that the people that were elected were beholden to a certain area of the city. So they were interested not so much in what was best for the entire city, but only for their section of the city. And the reformers said, well, why don't we elect people citywide that have the interests of the entire city in mind, instead of just those from smaller neighborhoods. So the idea of a council elected at large from the whole city was an attempt to be able to break the stranglehold of this neighborhood politics. Another thing was the idea that we'd have a merit system for local employees, so that you would take a test, and based on your achievement on those tests, that would determine your qualification to be able to have a job in local government, as opposed to just working for a political campaign and getting a job as a patronage job afterwards. So this then takes jobs away from those political machines and takes some of their power away. The advent of political primaries is also very important for helping to knock down the political machines. With the political primary now, instead of having political elites choose who's going to represent their party in the general election, we have the voters of an area actually voting in terms of who's going to represent them. So you take the power away from the party elites and give it to the general public so that they can vote. And again, another way to further weaken these machines. And then finally, the progressive movement was interested in the idea of direct democracy, because they sought to take power away from representative government. If the party machine is going to hold power and use it unwisely just for its own good, why don't we create a system in which the people can actually make legislation? So the difference between direct democracy and representative democracy is, in a representative democracy, we ask an elected official to make the policies for us. With a direct democracy, essentially people put ideas on the ballot and then we vote directly for that. And that was a way, in the minds of the reformers, to be able to take power away from these corrupt politicians. Now, there are a number of other things that were kind of largely structural about the American system at this time, above and beyond just kind of the reforms that were undertaken by the progressive movement. So one of the things was that we see as we get into the 30s and so on, that there's a decline of European immigration. And at that same time, we see that those immigrants that were here before now become assimilated into American culture on a broader basis. As a consequence of that, what we see is that the people are less beholden to the political machines. As generations of former immigrants become the second and third generations of those immigrants, they no longer feel the allegiance to the political machine because they didn't really receive the services that the machine provided. So the decline of European immigration and the assimilation of these immigrants then kind of takes away some of the need for the political machines in cities. The second thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the rise of the modern welfare state. So aid for families for dependent children, various other federal programs, work programs that are instituted during the New Deal were all things that now funneled money directly through local governments for the purpose of having people get jobs or to maintain a social safety net. And therefore, the whole structure of the way we provided aid to those in need pretty radically changed in the 1930s as we moved through the rest of the 20th century. So the machine wasn't as necessary at that point. Businesses also eventually kind of came around to the idea that municipal corruption wasn't a very good idea, and that it actually imposed costs upon them that made them less competitive, particularly as the economy got nationalized and internationalized. So when business started to get against this, they were the ones that also helped to push for some of these reforms. And then finally, as government got more complicated, predominantly because of new government programs, new investment by the federal government and state and local governments, we saw a need for professional bureaucrats, people that were trained in things like public administration, in how to work government effectively. And as a consequence of that, this sheer patronage power and giving jobs out to people on the basis of who they knew and how hard they worked for the political party didn't really work to help government function correctly. So again, we started to take jobs away from just patronage hires, giving them to people that were more qualified for their jobs. So, it's not to say that there aren't political machines around now, that political parties aren't strong in certain cities. They still are, but the trend of the way that political machines operated in late 1800s, early 1900s has changed quite a bit, and part of that was the change of institutions and the different types of local governments that we have.